And hopefully it works. Let's see. I will see it click on. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Climate Chat. I am your host, Dan Miller. And today we have a special guest, Genevieve Guenther, who wrote a new book, right, which is right behind her, The Language of Climate Politics. I just finished it yesterday, by the way, great book, and we're going to talk about it. A lot to go into about it. In fact, it does cover language, but it also covers politics and policy and denial and fossil fuel companies and things like that. So there's a lot to go into. But before we get started, Genevieve, first of all, welcome. And could you give us like a little brief background on how what you studied and how you got to writing this book?
Yeah. First of all, Dan, thank you for having me on. It's nice to be here. So my background is actually in Renaissance literature. It's not in climate studies at all. But after I had a child, I started to get more concerned about the climate crisis. And I started to feel that the way it was being talked about in the news media, and certainly among policymakers, was not, as far as I understood from what I had learned about classical rhetoric and the relationship between communication and politics, as far as I was concerned, from what I knew, it wasn't the most effective way to sort of persuade people that this was a serious problem that they needed to take action on. So I started reading the, research into climate communication, which is mostly done in the social sciences, not so much in the humanities, and not so much in sort of, communication and rhetoric studies. And then I, just went down the rabbit hole. I took college level courses in climate science. I did the climate reality training that Vice President Al Gore offers to people in order to learn how to communicate about the climate crisis from his perspective and do, various forms of activism. But I was even thinking about going back to graduate school. I have a PhD in English literature, but I was thinking about going back to graduate school and getting an MA in climate and society at the Columbia Climate School. So I had actually even hired a math tutor to get my math back up to speed so I could take the GREs again. So I was extremely passionate about the topic and specifically about climate communication, but I wasn't quite sure how I was going to be able to contribute. And then in 2017, I read a opinion essay in the New York Times written by this columnist named Bret Stephens, who at that time was a pretty inveterate climate denier. And this column was called Climate of Complete Certainty. And Mr. Stephens is an excellent writer. And so it was a very sort of elegantly rendered argument. But I realized that it was the sort of standard form of climate disinformation that had been circulated by fossil fuel and right-wing interests since about 2009. Naomi Oreskes covers this in Merchants of Doubt. And it's the argument that there's some sort of uncertainty about the science, that the science is so uncertain that we can't really be sure if climate change is real or, in some versions of the argument, whether it's sort of going to be bad enough to motivate serious policy changes, spending money in upfront investments into clean energy, et cetera. But because I was sort of trained in hearing how words are ambiguous, how they mean one thing to one group of people and another thing to a different group of people, I realized that the way these fossil fuel interests were using the word uncertainty was not quite how climate scientists were using the word. They were using the word to suggest that there was some sort of like state of unknowing, like as if climate scientists didn't have enough information to be really sure yet. But climate scientists, they use the word in that way sometimes, but in their discipline, uncertainty means something different. It actually means the range of possible outcomes that you can project with confidence. And indeed, confidence and uncertainty are actually synonyms in climate science. That you can talk about the uncertainty interval of a model, everything from the best case to the worst case outcomes, or you can talk about the confidence interval of those models. So I realized that they were weaponizing this kind of scientific term, using it in this kind of colloquial way and seeding sort of doubt among the general public and policymakers who don't have backgrounds in climate science. And what was really diabolical about this strategy of taking this word from science and using it in this propagandistic way was that now, anytime a climate scientist would talk about the uncertainty of their models, acknowledge the sort of range of possible outcomes that they could predict with confidence, they seemed to be kind of reinforcing the message that they weren't really sure whether climate change was real. And once I saw this dynamic that fossil fuel interests kind of mine the language of scientists, economists, climate advocates, weaponize it, and then put it in the public discourse, and then sort of manipulate our side, so to speak, into kind of amplifying fossil fuel propaganda, I started to see it everywhere. And that was the genesis of this book. And I was like, wait a minute, I don't need further training. I have the training that I need to write this book. So let me, do what I need to do to write this book. And lo, here it is.
Another word besides uncertainty is theory, because in theory, in the general public means something you're not sure about, but in science, it means law. So the law of gravity and the theory of gravity is the same thing. The theory of climate change means the law of climate change. And people
it's an excellent example of this kind of ambiguity. Exactly.
Yeah. So tell us about, I read the book and I could talk about it, but it's your book. Tell us about the book. What's it about? What should people expect from it?
Yeah. So the book essentially breaks down the language that produces what I call the new climate denial, and shows why that language rests on lies or sometimes just like false assumptions among people with, basically good motivations. And so it sort of debunks that new climate denial and offers you new language, new talking points, new strategies to talk about the climate crisis and its resolution in ways that will keep phasing out fossil fuels at the center of the climate change agenda. So what I discovered is that really most fossil fuel interests have now moved on from the strategy that there's some sort of uncertainty about the science because, it's getting a little absurd.
we can all see it. Right.
Try to pretend that climate change isn't real. Trump still does it because he's like, the master of trying to tell people, as Orwell would put it, to ignore the evidence of their eyes and ears. Right. But for most other right-wingers, fossil fuel interests, oil and gas companies, et cetera, they've all acknowledged that climate change is real. But now what they're trying to do is spread this new denial, which says we can keep using coal, oil, and methane gas and still halt global heating anyway. Or in some versions of the story, like, doesn't matter if we don't halt global heating because it won't really be that bad. So this narrative, I argue, gets sort of produced by the news media, by right-wing propaganda that gets echoed by people on, quote, our side. And it produces a kind of narrative that goes like this. So the narrative is, yes, climate change is real, but to say that it's going to be dangerous is, quote, alarmist. And anyway, it's going to, quote, cost too much to decarbonize our systems. Human welfare relies on the economic, quote, growth that is underwritten by fossil fuels, supposedly underwritten by fossil fuels. So the best thing that we can do is, foment, quote, innovation and increase our resilience. And anyway, and this is sort of the pièce de résistance. And anyway, they say it doesn't really matter what the United States or even the West does because emissions are still rising in, quote, India and China. So each chapter of the book takes on one of those words, shows how the claims that it signifies or that it transmits or that it, conveys are specious, either because they're outright lies or because they rest on assumptions that are faulty or just fantastical. And then it offers new talking points to combat this denial and help people envision, help people focus on the people who are spreading it and envision a better world to come once we've actually phased out fossil fuels and decarbonized our economy.
I'm glad you mentioned that quote, because I was going to ask you to read that from the introduction where you have this a few sentences there where you fit in every word. And yes, it's something that we hear very, very often. So I thought that was great. So the words that you focused on are alarmism. You have a chapter for each one, right? So alarmism, let's see, cost, growth, India and China, innovation, and what was the last one?
Resilience.
Resilience, right, way down there. I have so many notes, by the way. We're gonna have to have a discussion after the
Sounds
interview
great.
because I
Totally
want to
down.
go into detail on a lot of this with you, but it wouldn't be appropriate for the discussion here today. So those points, but I want to bring up. I want to get your thoughts. First of all, boy, there's so much to talk about. First of all, just read the book. First, I have to say, I learned, I know this stuff. I've been studying this stuff for 20 years. I learned a lot from the book because
Oh, wow.
you go into a lot about the economic theory and the people and stuff. I've always ignored that because I knew it was bullshit. It had to be. And the essence of this, and people won't believe this who watch the show, is that someone got a Nobel Prize. Nordhaus, what's his first name again?
William Nordhaus.
Well, William Nordhaus got a Nobel Prize for saying that the optimal temperature we should shoot for is 3 degrees Celsius of warming. Now, anyone who watches this show knows that's utterly insane. You'd have to be a crazy person. They would take you away if you said that to anyone who knows about climate change. That would be an utter disaster, destroy the entire economy, probably collapse civilization. That, and that's the optimal temperature. And people like Bjorn Lomborg repeat that and everything. So I knew that was crazy the very first time I heard it. So I never spent time learning about all those guys. And you educated me a lot. I also was at COP15 and knew sort of about the politics, but you really go into like what happened with Obama and all the BS stuff that happened there. So for me, it was actually very educational. So thank you for that as well. And also on this show, we interview the top climate scientists, we have solutions, but we always say that the most important thing is not, we have enough of that. We need to understand how to reach people. And that's what your book is about. It's sort of how to avoid being fooled. And then you also give recommendations for how to speak about climate. And of course, you also make the same recommendation I do, is talk to everybody you know about climate.
Right.
And that's super important.
Right.
I want to ask you about some words you don't have
okay.
in your book that are certain assumptions, like just these words, alarmism and everything. One of them, let's start off with 2 degrees Celsius.
Mm-hmm.
That's a target that you talk about in the book and how we can do it by reducing emissions. What are your thoughts on 2 degrees? Is that an appropriate target to shoot for?
Well, I mean, just this week, another scientific paper came out that said every 1/10 of a degree of warming over 1.5 degrees Celsius increases the risk of setting off tipping points pretty significantly. So 2 degrees Celsius is a target that was agreed upon for political reasons by governments who are party to the Intergovernmental the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, which is the treaty that, of course, sets out the terms for international governance on the climate crisis. So the governments that are party to that treaty, or at least the dominant governments, sort of came up with that target. Small island nations, the G88, as they're known, developing nations have long lobbied for a lower target because, of course, even if we don't set off tipping points going above 1.5 degrees Celsius, their nations, their peoples are going to be destroyed by that 0.5 degrees of warming between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. The other thing I have to say about this, and I talk about this a little bit in Alarmist, right, is that the impacts of warming are proving to be emerging on the worst side of the range of possible outcomes. So there have already been impacts of global heating in the climate system that no scientist anticipated at 1.2 or by some metrics 1.3 degrees of warming. So for example, in 2023, the biosphere had been so damaged by heat, drought, flood, and wildfire that plants globally although of course they did, absorb some carbon dioxide in order to nourish themselves, absorbed so little carbon dioxide overall that they no longer, at least that year, acted as a carbon sink for
Hmm.
our excess emissions. Now, hopefully this is a one-off related to the El Nino sort of bump up of heat, the heat in the ocean that was generated by this El Nino. But if this is the case, that it's already that global heating is already damaging our ecosystems so much that plants are no longer serving as a carbon sink for our emissions, that means that the urgency of phasing out fossil fuels and achieving a net zero ecologically integrated economy is even greater if that's possible. So that's what I have to say about those targets. But again, I think that, and I say this at the end of the chapter on alarmist, that accusation. I think that spending too much time focusing on science-based targets or global heating or even the impacts of climate change can be counterproductive because it can actually just feel overwhelming and terrifying and as if it's something you can't control. So I like to keep my focus on the people who are doing everything they can to prevent the phase out of fossil fuels and who are blocking the passage of climate policy, who are spending billions of dollars in order to sustain the fossil fuel economy, because those are the people, in my mind, who are directly threatening my child's future, the future of every child on this planet right now. And those are people whose power we can essentially overthrow, or at least, transfer to some other leaders who will lead us into a safe energy, safe materials use future. So,
and your book is consistent with that. And that, I mean, it's not a book about this is what we should do in terms of like climate solutions. It's not a climate solutions book, although you seem to imply, and that's what I want to ask you about. You do talk about net zero, and that's another term, by the way, which I think is we had Kevin Anderson on a couple of times, and he said that net zero is Latin for kick the can down the road. So what's your thought? I mean, that's his thought on net zero. You just use it as an appropriate goal to shoot for, and in some sense it is, but it's also this future goal. It's not the goal like right now.
That's correct. No, exactly. That is correct.
It's a part of the fossil fuel repertoire.
No, that's right. The book talks about the ultimate goal and not like small goals along the way. It is true. And I agree that very often net zero just means, if not kick the can down the road, but yes, we can keep using fossil fuels and remove their emissions with carbon dioxide removal, or indeed not emit them to begin with through carbon capture. So the amount of emissions and removals is very much up for debate in that umbrella term of net zero, which of course is why it's one of the terms that is most appropriated by fossil fuel interests, that comes up in, even oil and gas company advertising. So I agree that it's not an ideal term to just use without sort of framing it or contextualizing it as itself potentially a piece of propaganda. But there is no other, as far as I know, scientific way to describe the cycle of emissions that we'll have when we're no longer adding to the stock of the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Like some of our processes, like agriculture, are going to continue to emit carbon into the atmosphere, and we are going to have to remove that carbon so that it's net zero in order to no longer be adding to the concentration of carbon dioxide.
So let's talk about that,
because the term to sort of describe that, which is why I've used it. And I hoped that I took on the kind of ideological BS underlying the propagandistic use of the term in my chapter on innovation, which is entirely about this false promise that we can use technology to keep using fossil fuels.
Yeah, I want to get to that in just a moment, because that's a big part of the book. But you actually just said that, once we get to net zero, then things will stabilize. Do you think that, that's a very basic assumption, by the way, and let's assume it's true, okay? There is some question that might keep going up for quite a while, but if it does stabilize, stabilizing at 2 degrees could be catastrophic. And the only way to go down, is carbon dioxide removal, something that you pan quite a bit in your book. You say it hasn't worked so far. It's going to be too expensive. It's all fossil fuel propaganda. We had David Keith, by the way, on a week and a half ago, who sold his company to Oxy, which you talk about in the book.
For like a profit for him of like $75 million, according to the New York Times.
Is that okay? Well, congratulations to him, by the way. But he did a good job of talking about what he thinks, and I don't want to get into that whole thing. He justifies it as a good thing to happen.
What's solar geoengineering?
Oh, I want to get to it.
That's something you don't talk. Engineering is a good thing in his mind. Okay,
you don't talk about it in your book. I was going to ask you about that. I looked up SRM. I didn't find it anywhere in the book, but you didn't mention solar geoengineering at all. No. I don't think. And why did you leave that out? And isn't that part of the story and everything? Or
so this book is written for a very limited audience. It's written for mainstream Democrats who are either concerned or alarmed about the climate crisis. And that is a taxonomy from the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication. They have global warming's 6 Americas. Right. So there's 6 categories of kind of people and 6 different kinds of attitudes, feelings, views about the climate crisis. So the people who are most concerned are the concerned and the alarmed. And they are the majority of Americans, and they're predominantly, but not exclusively, Democrats. This book was written for concerned and alarmed Democrats. Okay. And because they support getting America to net zero emissions by 2050 by large margins, like almost 69% of Americans overall support that policy. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But only 31% of Americans support the phase out of fossil fuels. Now, that's kind of a partisan number. I talk about this in the book in the introduction. So this is kind of a partisan number, in that only 13% of Republicans support the phase out of fossil fuels, but still only a minority of Democrats, only 48% of Democrats support this. So to me, there's a deep contradiction in mainstream Democratic views about the climate crisis that is actually keeping fossil fuels in the mix and preventing us from resolving this problem. And I believe that because fossil fuel propaganda is so normalized by this dynamic of it echoing sort of in this bipartisan way, I believe that this contradictory view about the climate crisis is deeply influenced by the fossil fuel propaganda that I treat in the book. So the book has one goal, which is itself a kind of crazy goal, which is to try to get these people on board with phasing out fossil fuels and helping to get other people on board with phasing out fossil fuels. So it's like, I'm not going to get into debates about solar radiation management, because that's not right now part of the program of trying to resolve this contradiction in Americans' views about the climate crisis and like motivate people to talk about it in a new way. So that's why I just didn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. Whereas, I didn't even think I was going to really talk about carbon dioxide removal when I was starting. Like, I didn't know anything about Robert Solow before I started researching chapter 3. Like, all of this stuff, I just sort of became responsible for treating, because it does turn out to be the case that in climate change discourse, innovation means carbon capture or carbon dioxide removal, like not all the other cool technologies that we could possibly create and scale to help solve this problem. So I was like, okay, like, well, that was an area I'm gonna have to research. And I am not a Luddite. Like I as a woman who has been very happy to have birth control for most of my life, I like technology. I don't think that we have to like go back to some sort of pre-modernity in order to be like, you know, well integrated into the biosphere. I didn't know anything about carbon dioxide removal really before I started researching this book, but the research, I mean, the reality of it is, in order to remove 1 million tons of carbon dioxide, which is right now about, I don't know, 15 minutes of emissions in our global annual emissions, 15 minutes of emissions, you need to site solar panels on about 1,500 football fields worth of land. And so far, you also have to build an extra methane gas plant to produce the thermal energy to drive the sorbent process. So that to me seems like an enormous amount of land for 15 minutes of annual emissions, right? And then additionally,
it's not actually true, by the way, about that. I was part of going to do offsite to tell you about, but just take a look at Climeworks. They don't use solar panels; they use geothermal energy, and they don't inject it. They use the salt.
I took that. Wait. That is true, and it's quoted in the book from the National Academies of Sciences and Medicine. So the fact that these Climeworks direct air capture plants can use geothermal because they're sited at a place that gives them that capacity doesn't mean that other direct air capture plants sited at a different place would not have to generate energy using other techniques.
No, but they can, because it's only, as you point out, by the way, you may sound very high, but
please don't tell me that something I say in the book is not true. I also had it extensively fact-checked.
I'm just saying 100 degrees C is what you mentioned in the book, which is about right for the sorbent process. That's available almost everywhere with geothermal, because most geothermal, like Iceland, is 300 degrees C or 350 degrees C. Everywhere has like 100 degrees C. It's pretty easy to get to. And but that's a whole other separate discussion.
Well, I'm going to say National Academies does not model direct air capture without modeling fossil fuels, because they specifically say that these processes to create thermal power are still being innovated. So I'm just following them.
Okay. Anyway, but again, these are things that already exist. It's not like something that has to be proven in the lab first.
They exist in Iceland, but that doesn't mean they're going to exist in the U.S. Midwest. So,
but
there's a different geology than the U.S. Midwest.
Even by the way, I think it's an important point, because you do talk both about CCS, which is like capturing from a cement plant, let's say, versus direct air capture. Direct air capture can be anywhere in the world. It doesn't have to. It's wherever you have the energy and the hole in the ground and whatever. It doesn't have to be in the Midwest for any reason whatsoever. It works anywhere. Well, okay. So there's a whole section on that. Let's just say there, and you and I will have an offline discussion about some of the finer points. But I will say, I think here's the main point. I agree 100% with what you said in the book about the problem of using CDR as an excuse for avoiding emissions reduction, and that's what the fossil fuel companies do. And I agree, and they do it, and they quote it all the time, and absolutely true. That doesn't mean, and you even mentioned this in your book as well at the end, that doesn't mean we don't need carbon dioxide removal to survive. As you said, the IPCC models all require tremendous amounts. So there's a difference between... I
also spend a lot of time in the book explaining that those tremendous amounts of CDR being modeled by those mitigation scenarios rest on faulty assumptions, and I'm happy to describe what those assumptions are. So what I end up saying in the book is that we need carbon removal for net zero emissions, for the truly essential emissions like agriculture, potentially medical plastics, but that getting things like direct air capture to scale is going to be extremely challenging and extremely expensive. And that is just not an ideological position. That is what the evidence today already shows.
And so
what I try to suggest is that, yes, it's bad for oil and gas companies to promise that we can keep using fossil fuels and just sort of decarbonize them with, offsets through CDR. But it is also bad to overpromise what CDR can do, because it is that overpromising what CDR can do that seems to justify or license what oil and gas companies are saying about it. So it's not that, it's not that we don't need like potentially 5 to 10 gigatons of CDR a year, hopefully much less, because it's going to get really challenging to get over 1 to 2. And this is not me, this is what the CDR primer is saying, right? So what I'm trying to do here is put the limits of CDR front and center, not only to prevent oil and gas companies from making false claims, but also to prevent CDR advocates, who I understand need to sort of, drum up enthusiasm and optimism to get private investment. But I think that if you overpromise about the, capacities of CDR based on what we know now, you're actually just justifying and seeming to confirm the propaganda that's coming from oil and gas companies.
Okay. Well, all right. But then I guess the question I have is, everything you just said there assumes that, let's say we get to net zero and with a little bit of CDR, let's say, or going on. Is that okay?
Which part?
I mean, reaching net zero at some future temperature, which is higher than 1.5, because that's where we are now. So like 2.8 as a number that you put.
Are you asking me whether I'm opposed to the idea of negative emissions? Is that
yeah,
what you're
because
asking?
I think the only way to not stay at this elevated temperature, and the science would agree, I think, is to take CO2 away. Well, only two things: SRM, solar radiation management, or removing CO2. Those are the only two things we know about that could lower the temperature versus stabilizing the temperature. And there's an assumption about net zero and all these things.
I mean, right, in theory, we don't know that these things can do that yet.
We don't know what that.
We don't know that we can deploy enough CDR to lower the temperature of the world. We don't know that solar radiation management can be done in a way that lowers the temperature and keeps it low.
Maybe, by the way, I'm asking you a question. I agree. Well, no, I don't agree. I agree that it's used by fossil fuel companies for this propaganda to continue their social license. That's what your focus is on the book. 100% agree with what you're saying, and we have to take away that social license. I also agree. There's another problem. Once we get to the Holy Land and we have a net zero, are we okay or not? And I think the answer is no, we're not going to be okay. So we're going to have to do more things than just lower our emissions. But that's for a separate discussion. You talk about, by the way, different kinds of alarmed groups. Let's just really get into the meat of the book here. Antonio Gutierrez, by the way, I thought it was like a great. He's alarmed. He's the head of the United Nations, and he's alarmed. Can you just say a few words about him, because you talk about him in the book quite a bit?
Yeah, he's a really interesting case, because in 2017, anytime he would talk about the climate crisis, he would sort of adumbrate a kind of centrist view about the problem and its solutions. He had a very sort of, casual emissions reduction target in his imagination. He would reach out to oil and gas companies saying that they needed to be like, good, trustworthy partners, and that we needed to get industry on board. And he advocated for, very market-friendly policies. And I think what happened, and I argue that this happened perhaps for quite a few people, was that he was, I don't know the man, obviously, but I suspect he was partially radicalized by reading the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was published in 2018, because that report for the first time said that, we needed to get our emissions, not just reduce emissions, but get them to net zero by 2050, which was, which is really right around the corner. And that not only did we need to get to net zero by 2050, we needed to have our emissions entirely by 2030, which at this point is only 6 years away. And that, hasn't even begun to happen. And as you know, most of the models that were adumbrated in this report compiled and, described by the report, the mitigation scenarios were already overshoot scenarios because it was so late in the game that the only way they could sort of like get the computer to figure out how to halt warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius was by modeling, heating over 1.5 degrees Celsius and then using, billions and billions up to 1 trillion tons sometimes of carbon dioxide removal in order to return the temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius later in the century by 2100. And, since then, because there was such an outcry about this method of getting to 1.5 degrees Celsius, other scientists like Giori Rogelj, who was one of the lead authors of 1.5, the SR 1.5 report, have modeled halting warming at like 1.6 degrees Celsius without inordinate amounts of CDR, just by setting a temperature target and not trying to do it in the most supposedly cost-effective way. At any event, going back to Guterres, after he read that report, or for some other reason in the past couple of years, he has become one of the global figures most alarmed about the climate crisis. I mean, really, really calls it an existential threat, potentially catastrophic. He talks about how it hurts and kills people, children in particular, and he uses what I characterize as the sort of like characteristic language of the alarmed, which is a kind of highly literary, almost hyperbolic, metaphorical
global
language.
boiling, right? Yeah,
yes, exactly. So he once talked about, he said, the era of global heating or global warming is in the past, the era of global boiling has arrived. So that, and that got pounced on by all sorts of people who just did not like that kind of hyperbole whatsoever. To the extent it is hyperbole that in 2021, of course, the temperature of the ocean around the Florida Keys was that of a hot bath. So, okay, yeah, a hot bath isn't boiling, but I don't know. It seems to me that people need to understand that the ocean is becoming hot, literally. So anyway, so I talk about Guterres and I talk about sort of, some, not all, but many climate scientists' objections to that kind of language for various reasons. I mean, mostly because their authority is constructed on the idea that they take a kind of dispassionate, empirical approach to their research, that they don't, have their emotions clouding their scientific judgment, and they don't want to be associated with people.
Right. So we have very few leaders actually, besides Gutierrez, who are speaking out in there's direct language like that. So
correct.
We need more. You talk about doomers, by the way, and you list 3 kinds of doomers. First kind who misrepresent and say civilization is over in a decade, tipping point's already passed. 2, politics and climate change are impossible to change, so we're screwed. And 3, the wealthy who say, well, yeah, it's all going to happen, but I'm going to be okay. I have to add, there's a 4th one because we've interviewed him here, and I think you might know Elliot Jacobson. And during he's like one of the most famous doomers. He's what he calls a pro-nature doomer, which I described as pro-doom. Like, he doesn't want you to succeed in your work or any of our work because he wants it to be over as quickly as possible so that nature survives, because we're a cancer on. I'm not. If you have this point of view, you're correct, I guess. If humans are a cancer on nature, then you want to wipe out the cancer. So there is that other kind of doomer. I'm going to throw. There's a 4th kind of doomer, which I was surprised. I don't know.
I would enfold that kind of doomer into. I would enfold him into doomer number 3, because I think that is actually like a very kind of privileged, self-centered, an utterly narcissistic point of view, because if you're just going to say, oh, all of humanity should die, what does that mean? That, like, children who are growing up right now, these little like toddlers or babies or whatever, that they're somehow to be like exterminated? Like, I just
Not
find that,
exterminated, but no.
yeah, I find that a kind of, I don't know, I just find it a form of nihilism that
Okay.
that is not actually pro nature, because nature runs on love. And I think that human beings are not essentially a cancer. I think we are going down a very tragic path. Things are, we've made tremendous mistakes, but we can still see what we're doing and transform. I
Okay.
mean, there's been tremendous transformation in human systems over the past 10,000 years, and it can just keep going.
Okay. All right. Well, by the way, I'm sure he's going to listen to this, so he
Okay.
probably will respond on Twitter or something like that.
Okay.
You talked about cost. I don't know what to say about that, but you talked about Nordhaus, and it's such it. When I first heard this is, to me, it's like saying, oh, you need quadruple bypass surgery. I think you should go talk to an economist. Like, what? What are you talking about? Like, is that the person you go to ask about climate science and whether 3 degrees warming is the optimal temperature, which would destroy civilization and the entire economy?
Yeah.
It's so, I don't even know what to say. It's so bizarre. If I mean, people who read it might not know, right? In fact, as you describe, this is not like someone said, oh, that's a crazy idea. The entire government followed his writing, and policy is set to all of this, and people use his models for everything. And yet it's as insane an idea as I can think of.
Right. There's
Any
no
comments on that? I mean, it was like, it's very kind of
Yeah, I
disheartening to
mean,
read this stuff.
there's no scientific basis for his damage function, essentially. He omits most of what earth science says are going to be the impacts of global heating in his models. Originally, and for many decades, he based his estimates of global damages on surveys that he did of his friends.
That's right.
Himself in the survey too. But in some ways, I feel like Nordhaus is sort of less the problem than Robert Solow, his PhD advisor, who's the guy who came up with a theory of perpetual growth.
Yeah.
Based on technological innovation. Because actually, like, Nordhaus's assumption is that, I mean, he does two things. So one thing that he does is he omits the mathematical chance that global heating could lead to catastrophe up to and including the infinite cost of human extinction, which is something that his colleague, now passed away, Martin Weitzman at Harvard, wrote passionately about. And I talk about this in the chapter, that Nordhaus is able to model this sort of optimal balance between costs of warming and costs of climate policy, supposed costs of climate policy, because he, cuts off or parameterizes his tail of his model, like to make it a sort of thin tail so that he can give you a kind of nice, crisp number. But as Weisman said, the uncertainty about what will happen at higher levels of warming is such that you cannot actually mathematically rule out the possibility of the infinite cost of extinction, which means that in fact, these models need to have a very thick and very long tail. So that's one reason that he comes up with this completely crazy idea that we should let the planet heat up 3 degrees Celsius by 2100. But the other one is that economic growth is just exogenous in his model. Like he just assumes that growth is going to continue as the planet heats up, because there's no sort of relationship between the biosphere and the economy for him. And this is why I think that assumption is why his work has seemed so plausible, because indeed that's the assumption of every economist and every policymaker, and really most of us in some ways, who think that, and somehow humanity is like separated from nature, or we're safe from nature because we can go inside and turn the air conditioning on, and like somehow what happens out there and the externalities of the economy don't have anything to do with us. And so,
Hmm.
it's one thing to take on Nordhaus, which I do in cost, but I also try to sort of trouble those assumptions in the growth chapter and talk about the way that these beliefs were created almost single-handedly by Nordhaus's PhD advisor, Robert Solow, who's a Nobel laureate in his own right,
Hmm.
who essentially was the first one to model perpetual economic growth by taking sort of land out of his model, any scarcity land might put on perpetual economic growth, and replacing land as a production function in growth models with something that he called technological possibilities, which he made sort of homologous to the first degree, just allowing him to model like, constant rates of return. But as I talk
Hmm.
about in the book, there's a footnote in that famous paper where he says, okay, yeah, this is actually just theory. Like, this is just a hypothesis. And it's only going to apply to the real world if we can, quote, hack arable land out of the wilderness at essentially constant cost,
Right.
right? Because people need to eat.
Right. 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 No, no,
You
I
can't have a
know.
growing labor force if people can't eat. Um,
But
so yeah. And so
I think it's fine that economists have crazy ideas. I just don't know why we're listening to them. That's my
But
question.
again,
But
it's like policymakers, turn to experts to help them make decisions under radical uncertainty. And so they're
mm,
not going to spend 18 months reading all of Robert Solow because they have to govern, right? So they're going to
uh,
turn to experts to get the answers for these, but the experts are actually
don't know
working with
whether.
the assumptions that seem true in the 20th century, but that climate change is proving to be false,
Yeah, that's true. Now, one thing you don't talk about, I think, directly in there, but is personal carbon footprints. And speaking of like
Mm.
fossil fuel propaganda, do you believe that it's been said that the personal carbon footprint came up with by British Petroleum to shift the blame on you versus on them? Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think that's true, or
No, this is exactly another example of the dynamic I cover in the book. So the carbon footprint is actually a legitimate idea in sustainability research, right? It
Sure,
is
okay.
a way of thinking about consumption and sustainability, right? So this was like legitimate research done in sustainability, material science, and BP was like, oh, that is a great idea to weaponize because as soon as you start talking about people's personal carbon footprints, you're going to make them feel guilty, overwhelmed, and you're going to take the focus away from the policymakers and the people and the companies that are trying
Yeah.
to keep fossil fuels in the mix and this sort of systemic issue that needs to be resolved with politics. So this was another way that they took this legitimate idea and weaponized it, turned it into a propaganda campaign to make people try to make people essentially to either take on the wrong thing or just feel so guilty and overwhelmed that they just tuned out of the problem entirely. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's just not a very useful way of thinking about a problem that is entirely systemic and that would be continually getting worse, even if every single one of us reduced our own personal carbon footprint to zero because our energy, transportation, agricultural systems, they all rely on fossil fuels still. And it's the problem is to get fossil fuels, or the solution rather, is to get fossil fuels out of our systems.
I agree. Now, I have a million more questions for you, as you can probably imagine, but you have a hard stop coming up in about 7 minutes. So I'm going to return to Stacy for our first question and maybe some questions from YouTube.
Hi, thanks for being
Hi.
here, Genevieve. I I'll skip over some of what you said and go with my original question. The Democratic presidential candidate has changed, and the language has as well. They've shifted from they're a threat to democracy to they're weird, and it seems like it's been effective. Do we need to make a similar shift from we're ending the world to this isn't a good idea? And I'll drop in my personal thing related to climate is transportation.
Mhm.
And I'm go bikes and go transit and human driving. Stop killing people. Um, do we need to, like, is this the secret to unlock, to like sort of dumb it down? Is it representative of our intellectual decline, or just our inability to take in things that are quite large?
Well, I mean, I think it's not a matter of dumbing down. It's just working on a different level that is important. So, political campaigns are about who you want to identify yourself with, right? Who gives you a vision that you want to support because you want to be like those people, right? So it's super smart to point out how weird Trump really is, and Vance, because it makes you not want to identify yourself with those people, right? And then, she goes on, and Vice President Harris goes on in her campaign events and her speeches to, describe her policy priorities. Her ads are policy focused too, but on social media and in this kind of like, I don't know, TikTok sphere, she's very skillfully pointing out that the other side is weird and gross and not people that we in America really feel comfortable identifying ourselves with. And I think that would be great if we could use that strategy about oil and gas executives and people who support fossil fuels. The problem is that most of our mainstream institutions are on their side and not our side. For now, we're the weird ones in our mainstream culture. And so it's going to be really hard to deploy that effectively when they have kind of centrist power on their side, and we're still associated with the hippies. But, I think I've found in my own research into climate communication, aside from this book, that there are two things that people really respond to. One is pollution. Like, nobody likes pollution, right? So you hear this like, make polluters pay, blah, 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 but people don't associate sort of oil and gas with pollution. So I think what you can do is you can talk about how much fossil fuels stink. Like, talk about how car exhaust smells terrible. Airplane exhaust smells terrible. Like, the gas that comes out of your stove, it's nauseating. Like, just getting that kind of like feeling of disgust generated about fossil fuels is a sort of similar tactic, just to feel like, oh, I don't want that. That's weird, or that's gross, or no. So I do think that it's important to sort of appeal to people's viscera and their guts, and not just their intellects. So that's what I think about that.
And by the way, fossil fuel pollution that you're talking about kills 8 million people a year.
Exactly.
And it's not even talked about. To me, it's 1 in 5 deaths.
Exactly.
And it's not even talked about, which is very strange, because obviously if people were aware of that, you would think, that would be, there's like nothing more, right? Nothing kills more people than that.
No, it's unbelievable.
Okay. Stacey, you have another question from YouTube or something, or go to Eli?
I didn't actually see any questions.
Okay.
Most of it was
Eli?
about the interim things that we skipped over because we're out of time. Thanks.
And we're almost out of time. Eli, do you have a question for Genevieve?
Well, okay, so first a comment. I put some references in the room chat. You mentioned the Amazon sink being zeroed out in 2023. The evidence is that after droughts, it comes back, but at a lower level. So we're losing the Amazon sink. And there are other feedbacks that are not properly represented in climate models that are going to come back to bite us. And specifically, what I want to convey is that the battle on zeroing out emissions is the battle we needed to win by 1990, and we didn't. And although we do need to end emissions, that's necessary but insufficient. And
but do you have a question though? Do you have a question, Eli?
Well, okay. In terms of your discourse, where are you least opposed to carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management? Let me put it that way.
Well, look, I mean, it is true that we should have zeroed out emissions already, right? We should already have a net zero economy, but we have not won the political battle yet. And we can't skip over the political battle, right? It's still ahead of us. And so we can't like take on the fight that would happen after we've achieved net zero emissions today. Because if we do not phase out fossil fuels and create a net zero economy, there is no carbon dioxide removal or solar radiation management in the world that will allow human civilization to survive or flourish.
Well, that
So,
isn't necessarily true, but more importantly,
see, there it is.
These two things are not.
That's exactly the problem.
Not mutually.
You are implicitly proposing solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal as something that'll allow us to survive if we keep using fossil fuels.
No. Well, okay.
I don't know. That's fair.
These two things are not related in the sense that, yes, that can be true, but it isn't necessary that we continue with fossil fuels just because we pursue carbon dioxide removal and SRM. Economics is going to kill fossil fuels.
By the way, we're out of time. This is actually we should have. Too bad we don't have like another 10 minutes to talk about that. But Genevieve, thank you so much. First of all, thanks for writing the book. As I said, I learned a lot from it. I think for your target audience that you mentioned, I think they're going to enjoy it. They're going to learn something. They're going to learn about some of the crazy stuff that goes into our policymakers. It's kind of breathtaking sometimes. But anyway, thanks for writing it. Thanks for being on the show, talking with us. I know you have limited time, so there's going to be a shorter show than we normally do. But let's you and I chat a little bit offline sometime when you have some time. I want to go through some of the more finer details of some of the things that were in there that we didn't have a chance to talk about today. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone else for joining. Please like this program so more people see it. Please follow us here on YouTube and also on Twitter. And there's links in the description, by the way, to Genevieve's homepage, which are linked to the book, and also a little of her background and her Twitter account and all of that, so you can follow her as well. So thank you, and we're going to get you off here hopefully in time for your next one.
Thank you so much for having me on. This was a really robust and very challenging and very productive discussion, I thought. I really appreciate it.
I certainly appreciate it too. Thank you so much. Right.